Jeff, welcome to Texas. This is your third day here. We've had a great time with you. As you know, this micro interview is part of a series that we are doing with visitors on connected to our infrapolitical project. What I would like to do is to take advantage of an idea that you explained to me, which is that the notion of, if I can say it bluntly, and you can explain later, in the same way that the concept of history blocks historicity, in the same way that the concept of metaphor blocks metaphoricity, the concept of politics, for instance, blocks politicity. That structure, I think, is extremely rich and provocative, and I would like you to expand a little bit on that.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure talking to you for these 3 days. What I have in mind when I say that is based on things Derrida says explicitly, perhaps most explicitly, about metaphor and metaphoricity. And there the idea is that the concept of metaphor, which is a philosophical concept, is actually a way of restraining and restricting what he might call the play of metaphoricity. So language is metaphorical through and through in a certain sense, but only in a sense that is liberated by a deconstruction of the standard metaphysical, philosophical concept of metaphor. I think the same is true of very many other concepts in Derrida's thinking. So many people have suggested that he's not interested in history, or he doesn't think history is important, or he doesn't care about history, or he denies history in some way. And really nothing could be further from the truth. Derrida is interested in a very radical sense of historicity, and his issue with metaphysics, which he calls the metaphysics of presence, following Heidegger, is that the concepts of history that tradition have provided tend to reduce and block and arrest the movement of historicity, which is what he's really interested in. Similarly, I think, though I don't think he says this anywhere explicitly, with the concept of politics. Politics is a metaphysical concept, and as a metaphysical concept it comes with a certain number of presuppositions and a certain number of sedimentations. And my own thought in working on what I call the politics of politics is that philosophical concepts of politics tend to reduce the politics out of politics. They're interested in bringing politics to an end in something else. Politics is seen as a way to some other state of being or state of affairs in which politics would no longer be necessary. So what I'm trying to get at in my provocative, I hope provocative formula, the politics of politics, is to bring back into view, but from a philosophical point of view, that aspect of politics that the metaphysical concept of politics has more or less systematically attempted to reduce, usually by placing it in some kind of teleological perspective, at the end of which it would be overcome, redeemed, sublated, brought to an end in some kind of way.
Could you say, or would you accept the formulation that the notion of the politics of politics is a way of letting politics be, letting politics happen?
I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it, which I hadn't explicitly thought before. But I do think we were talking before about the relationship between Derrida and Heidegger, which is of course complex and rich and difficult to unravel. And I was saying that I thought that where Heidegger talks about Seinlassen and Gelassenheit and letting beings be, Derrida might slightly reformulate that into something like letting events happen or let events come. In Derrida it does seem as though that there be events is almost an unconditional. It's an object of unconditional affirmation. probably it would be possible to apply that kind of thinking to the notion of politics. So metaphysics has, I guess we could say in Heideggerian language, arraigned politics into some kind of configuration which does not let it be. And similarly, perhaps the politics of politics, as I formulated it, could be a way of saying, let the events of politics come, let them happen, and be wary of placing them into the standard teleological perspectives, which I think is the dominant way in which the metaphysical tradition has tried to think about politics. And there we've talked, for example, about what Kant says about perpetual peace, and how that teleological perspective runs into certain forms of quite radical trouble, I think, figured by the graveyard, which is perhaps the best image of perpetual peace. Or on the other hand, what Aristotle says about democracy, where it seems as if the teleological fulfillment of democracy runs at a certain point into a catastrophic reversal, where democracy turns into something quite different from itself. And of course, along the lines of what Derrida talks about as autoimmunity, I think.
There are a number of contemporary thinkers that think about the event in terms that I would consider clearly ontological. In other words, the goal of their thinking seems to be to establish an ontology of the event. So I have two questions for you. Do you think deconstruction is really a thinking of the event? And if so, what would be the status of the event in deconstruction?
Well, I think Derrida would be very suspicious of talk of an ontology of the event. For Derrida, event would be one of the terms that comes along in the wake of the trace, for example, most obviously perhaps, as a way of thinking that is radically contesting ontology. Something he's very interested in, the 1964-65 seminar on Heidegger, is to attribute to Heidegger a project not just of destroying the history of ontology, but of destroying ontology itself. And I do think that for Derrida, once he's formulated the trace structure, which he does pretty much already in that seminar, but certainly around that time, then ontology is no longer possible. Now, insofar as event for Derrida has the predicates that he gives it of unforeseeability, unknowability, non-presence, dislocation of time, and so on, I think he thinks that those predicates would make it unavailable to anything you could reasonably call an ontology. So his suspicion would be that the very project of an ontology, even be it an ontology of the event, is already reducing the eventness of the event in a way that he would find suspicious. Now, of course, it's possible that some of the people trying to develop an ontology of the event are using the term ontology loosely or incautiously, or it's just a way of talking, and really what they're doing is perhaps not so very far from what Derrida would be trying to do. But I think Derrida's vigilance with regard to terminology and the baggage that traditional concepts bring with them is still extremely salutary and has perhaps been a little bit forgotten recently.
All right. Well, I think that the thinkers I'm thinking of, their notion of the event wouldn't have much to do with the Derridian one, or yours indeed, which of course I hear you connect the notion of the event to your own notion of scatter. I have a question for you, which is scatter a political concept before anything else, or is scatter precisely the condition of a politics?
It's not immediately a political concept. I came up with the notion of scatter in a context where I had indeed been thinking about politics and political philosophy, indeed of Kant, and I was trying to find a way of formulating the situation that results from what I'd previously been inclined to call an interruption of teleologies. So my earlier thought was that the teleological progress towards perpetual peace is maybe interrupted at a certain point by this catastrophic prospect of it turning into universal destruction or a universal graveyard. And I came to think that that figure of a teleology progressing and then being interrupted is still mortgaged to the general teleological schema that I was hoping to disrupt. And if I tried to think of an interruption that had always already begun, then perhaps scatter was a more appropriate way of thinking about it. However, I think on the one hand that kind of configuration is generalizable beyond the normal concepts of politics. I think it affects all teleological structures as such. On the other hand, I think that what it does to those structures might reasonably be described as a kind of politicizing of thought. I think scatter opens thought in general to something like a possibility of politics. And I'm inclined to say after 3 days of talking to you that maybe this bears a relationship at least to what you would call the infra-political. It's not political, it's not yet quite political, it's not political in the traditional sense, but it prepares a ground or gives some kind of condition of possibility, if we can still talk that language, to politics.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thank you.